Because the COVID virus is here and we're not sure if it's chartered or uncharted territory, I've asked Stephen Brown of Etienne Lawyers to come along and give us a few clues about how we might deal with it. And because this is live, we might give people a bit of time to get on before we get into the serious stuff. Good morning, Stephen. What's the weather like in Sydney?
It's wet, rainy, and a little bit chilly. Not cold, but there's just that chill in the air. You can tell that summer's ending, regrettably.
Well, here in beautiful downtown central Victoria, we have 17 degrees, sunshine, cold. But we get used to that because we're in Victoria. You know, very, very warm and bright one day and cold and dull the next. All sorts of strange stuff.
But it makes it fabulous for glue vine and hot fires and the smell of wood burning. So, yep.
The odd hot toddy.
Pick up on the roundabout.
So all good fun. So right across the world, we've got this thing called COVID-19, commonly known as the coronavirus, or in certain countries, I noticed they're referring to it as the C virus. Oh. So interesting names all around the place.
Yes. I think I'm going to stick to Corona.
Corona sounds fine. It's easy to make a joke of in Australia anyway because of those certain type of beer that is around. So where do we start? We've got lots and lots of small businesses, medium-sized businesses. They've planned things well into the future. And all of a sudden, we're not allowed to have a group of people together.
Yes, it's a challenging position because the legal general rule is that courts seek to enforce contracts as much as possible. The law seeks to enforce the bargain that two or more people make. And the general rule is that a business interruption, unless it is expressly dealt with in the contract or can fit a very high regime known as frustration or impossibility, is not an excuse. So an event that causes you inability to perform the contract, either through inconvenience or it makes it more difficult or it becomes more expensive for you to perform the same task that you have originally contracted to do, doesn't give you an out from performing the contract. So that's one issue that we have to look at. Now, the exceptions are this doctrine, two main ones, a doctrine of frustration. Frustration is a concept of law which is extremely high and difficult to prove. And it basically, you have to prove three things: that there's a particular event that's preventing the contract from being performed at all. The event is outside of the party's control. And the particular event is both unforeseen and unforeseeable. Now, if we were to take this with the coronavirus, the event certainly is preventing contracts from being performed, so the supply chains are being disrupted. Is the event beyond parties' control, then most likely you'd get a tick on that one. The third one, though, is the inevitability of a pandemic unforeseeable? Well, we had one in 1919 with the Spanish flu, and the government and health departments have been talking about the impending issue with SARS and MERS and all these types of things having arisen some time ago. So it's probably highly unlikely that anyone could argue that it's unforeseen or unforeseeable. And therefore, you may not meet the threshold to have frustration. Another challenge with frustration is that if frustration is proven to exist, it ends your entire contract. So if you've got a 10-year supply contract and you wish to argue frustration and you're 2 years into your 10-year contract, then you will, by raising frustration, and if you are successful, end up destroying the next 8 years of your contract. So do you want to, in fact, raise that issue? So that's frustration on the other side, on one side. There is another possibility that some contracts may have specific clauses known as force majeure. Force majeure is a civil law concept that came into English law through a court case in 1915. And essentially what it means is an act of God. But the word act of God has no common law implication at all. In order for a force majeure clause to work, the particular triggers that give rise to the event that will suspend your performance of the contract must be set out in the contract. So the types of things that are normally there are strikes, inability to source raw materials, power failures, mechanical breakdowns. If a particular force majeure clause has a trigger that would cover sickness, pandemic, thereby coronavirus, then that clause could be used. But unless it has a specific trigger, it's unlikely to be able to be used. The difference with a force majeure to frustration is that force majeure clause, if activated, suspends the operation of the contract, not destroying it. So it's a better provision. More rarely, in fact, very rarely, there are provisions that I have seen and I've used called hardship clauses. And they're just a general clause which says from one party to the other, hey guy, I've got some problem here. And the problem is this. As a consequence of this particular problem, I need a suspension of the contract. And you would need to have a hardship clause in your contract to enact such a provision. The third issue is, and this may be the one that's here, is that parties to a contract are free contractually to vary their contract. And because of the interruption that's existing, yes, there are problems with the supply chain, but it's likely that your customers won't want the goods anyway, because they won't be able to sell them because they won't have customers to sell them to. So this is a double-edged sword that we're concentrating on, well, can I perform? Well, the question may be, do my customers actually want the goods or services that I'm performing at the moment? And the answer may be they don't. And therefore, the common sense and practical issue may be to contact them saying, where are you with the coronavirus situation? And can we mutually agree to have a timeout? To call a timeout on our contract and regulate it yourselves in a common sense approach. So that seems to be the more sensible, if it's possible. It will depend upon the mutual agreement of the parties. Unless you've got some provision in the contract that allows you to suspend, which many contracts don't, then the position is that you are stuck with it at a common law. And this did occur in 1919 with the Spanish flu, with the Spanish influenza. I think, though, the impact wasn't seen as much as it may be today, because we're closer with the world. There's more going on in the world, and we're closer. Therefore, the impact economically will be seen it'll be more harshly felt than what it was in 1919, just because of that closeness. So in a nutshell, that's the big picture so far as contracts. And contracts look at your customers, to whom you supply to, your suppliers, and of course your employees, because all your employees are engaged under contracts, and therefore the same rules that I've just discussed above apply to them.
Indeed. So Clive's simple version of all of that, we've got to look really diligently at what we want to provide in the future, what we think we can provide, what we are required to provide, and if there's an issue, we better get on the phone and talk to somebody.
Yep. or email.
Or well, preferably email in the end to confirm that we actually had the conversation if we did it by phone.
Well, if you do it by phone, keep a recording of it.
Yes.
As long as, of course, you tell them you're recording it.
Yes. So now you mentioned right at the end there the employees. Employees are a very important part of any business.
Yep.
And now, particularly, they're going to be very important to a business's bottom line, because we might have to send them home to isolate them under the rules. And will we still have to pay, or will they be eligible for some leave or some sick leave? Is there any idea on that at this stage, Stephen?
Short answer, no. And not from a government perspective. The general rule is that at common law, under your contracts, you have no right to stand down employees. So if you've engaged an employee to come to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, then you've got to keep on employing them. You can't say, there's no work today, go home. You can tell them to go home, but you've still got to put your hands in your pocket and make the payment to them. There are some awards where there are provisions, but they're rare. Obviously, if they're casual employees, you don't have to schedule a casual employee. And similarly with part-time employees, you may be able to regulate them far better. But full-time employees, you must keep employed. That's, again, as I say, the general proposition. If you have to isolate them, then you might be able to use your sick pay. So you may be able to say, look, we'll pay you sick pay, and thereby whittle that down, because it's still an obligation. So you might be able to do that. You may be able to do a deal with with the employees by saying, look, we'll give you holiday pay and we'll keep on paying you. But that again will be a matter between you and the employee to do that. You could also have a deal with unpaid leave, or you can continue to pay their salary because they may be able to work remotely from home, depending upon what it is that they're doing. Obviously, if they're a shop assistant serving tables at a cafe, they're not going to be able to do that remotely from their home. So there will be some types of employees that this won't be possible. And that's, of course, if the cafe's open, because if it's like what's happened in France, there won't be any cafes open because they'll all be shut down. One possibility is that there's nothing particular in the Fair Work Act. There is section 524 subsection 1, which says that an employer can make an application to stand down their employees, and there's a list of factors, and one of them is where there's a stoppage of work for any cause. And it may be possible for employers to be able to approach the Fair Work Commission to enliven that particular provision as a consequence of the coronavirus. Now, whether it's not, I don't know of any cases at the moment, it's all very new, but looking at it just over the weekend to see what some clients might be able to do, there is that particular issue.
Mhm.
It's also possible that the government may just pass some form of legislation to deal with this, which will overcome a lot of these particular problems. Whether they'll think about it, I don't know, but they're the challenges that we're certainly facing. There's also the other issue about work health and safety in the workplace. As an employer is a person in control of a business or undertaking, and therefore you do have health and safety issues. Consequently, is it appropriate to allow people to come to work? If you have a large organisation of 500 or more, then based upon what the government's saying, then you shouldn't have them all there anyway.
That's right. We're not supposed to meet in groups of 500 or more, are we?
No. Funnily enough, just as I was coming on to the presentation this morning, the first 5 emails that I saw in my email box were all cancellation of events.
Yes, well, events was going to be my next question. Well, because we probably actually covered this in your introduction to a broad look at what's going on. So if we have an event scheduled and it's X number of people, well, if it's more than 500, we already know. But I think the story about meeting in groups mentioned enclosed spaces. What if there's only 8 or 10 or 12 people, but the space is enclosed, like maybe a small presentation room, only as big as 2 or 3 in one-person offices, perhaps? How does that fit?
Such as the presentation I'm doing at the University of Technology tomorrow, where there's going to be a group of 20 people hearing a lecture that I'm doing. In that particular situation, it's not 500. They're still permissible at this point in time.
And if people were a little bit concerned about turning up to an event like that, would it be appropriate and proper to then advise, okay, well, we'll do it online? So instead of you going out to put yourself at potential risk, could you make that presentation from your office like we are today, and those other people, the attendees, can pop in and see it that way? Would that still constitute delivering the event?
All of this, let's go back to something we spoke about quite some time ago with one of our webinars. To remind everyone, a contract is a checklist, no more, no less. And yes, there's lots of legal gobbledygook around it, but at its core, a contract is a checklist of who is to do what, when are they to do it, and how. And therefore, in that sense, you need to look at the contract and say, well, what's happening, when's it happening, and how? And you need to look at the contract to see how the contract deals with this particular situation. So if an event says it's being scheduled here, but it may be transmogrified into a person-to-person to a webinar, or both webinar and person-to-person, then of course it will be possible. Mm-hmm. If it says if you don't show up to take your seat after you've paid, you get no money, then unless the promoter is willing to refund the money outside the terms of the contract, unless you show up, you will get no refund, because that's what the contract says.
Yep.
Consequently, it's all about what is in the contract. So if the contract allows for that to happen, then yes, it can. If not, if the contract doesn't allow, we go back to our variation again, and the promoter could contact the people saying, would you prefer to take the risk of getting coronavirus by attending, or do you want to log in by doing a webinar? And they may or may not discuss a refund at that time, depending on how the promoter wishes to handle it. So with events, it'll all depend upon, again, what is in the contract.
And again, it comes back to have a conversation.
It comes back to having conversation. It's all about common sense and conversations, regrettably, because sometimes people aren't overly sensible in what they talk about. But that's the situation we have.
Indeed, difficult times, but essentially we keep coming back to simple.
Yeah, a lot of it's simple. Someone just asked a question: what if a venue has to close? If a promoter, it would be prevented from holding an event because the venue that they had contracted closed, then I would probably put that into frustration, because the event is prevented from being performed because the venue is not available to them. The closure of the event is outside the promoter's control because it's imposed upon the promoter by the landlord of the premises. And it would really be unforeseeable and unforeseen that a landlord would not allow you to use the premises. So I think in that particular instance, frustration would be available, which would allow the promoter then to go back to the participants saying, the contract that I have with you has been frustrated by the actions of a third party. So I think they probably work their way that way.
Indeed. And again, in the end, it all sounds fairly simple the way you explained it, Stephen. Thank you for that.
Yes, well, I'm treating that everyone will act sensibly. It's where you've got someone who chooses not to act sensibly that you can have some issues. There is something else that could possibly be looked at, and there is the Australian Consumer Law unfair contract terms. And it is possible that you might be able to rely upon them to change the terms and conditions of a contract as well because of this particular event. Now, because the terms are new, they've only been around the last 4 or 5 years, and because this particular, thank God, only pandemics happen once every 100 years or so, we don't have a lot of history to back us up, but it is possible. I could see how an argument could be structured to potentially use that, and if you put it before the right court, then you might be able to exculpate your liability by getting a judicial sanction.
I like that word, exculpate.
Yes, Grammarly keeps saying, my vocabulary use is 74% greater than other people. But it's not really good for advisors, because if you're going to get people going to the dictionary, it is a problem. But I think that's basically because there's too many legal words in legal advices anyway.
Indeed. Nonetheless, we appreciate your advice, even if we do have to look it up in the dictionary occasionally. Especially in these trying times, because it hasn't popped up out of nowhere, of course, but it seems to have gathered a pace across this last week, which has seen things change enormously in the landscape of how we meet and greet people. All manner of things have changed. So is there a blanket advice that we should, how we might address what we've got planned for the future?
In a legal sense, or in a social sense? I don't know.
Which one did I mean? Whichever one you can answer.
Being a lawyer, I have high opinions of myself, so I'm sure I can answer them both ways, but it may or may not be appropriate. Look, from a legal perspective, then it probably, okay, next time I'm drafting a contract, and the next time I have put a force majeure clause in, I will certainly put in it pandemics.
Yep.
I will add the trigger for the first force majeure to make sure that it's there as something that the clients can rely upon should they have a need to.
Yep.
I will also consider discussing with the client the ability to put a hardship clause in. Now, hardship clauses, if you do put them in, you're likely to have the counterparty want the same rights.
Mm-hmm.
So you then have this countervailing situation of, okay, yes, I put the hardship clause in to give myself the ability to suspend performance, but then having highlighted that, it can, if the other side say, well, I want that right too, it's a bit disingenuous to you to say, well, I want it, but you can't have it.
Yes.
So unless you're Woolworths with a small supplier, or Procter & Gamble with a raw material supplier, you won't have the bargaining position. You'll have to accept that both parties can do it. Therefore, you may be penalised when they have a problem. So you've got to make a judgment call as to whether you want to put that hardship clause in. So certainly you would do that. There'll always be challenges though, because what will be the determination of a pandemic? Will it be when the government discloses it, when you say it? So there'll still be wiggle room that the parties can argue about over the edges, because no matter how clear you put something in it, it may not get it across the line. Unless, of course, you say, look, it's got to be under the Biosecurity Act of 2015, if it is listed as a communicable disease, then that is sufficient for you to trigger the force majeure clause. And so you may go to those levels and have a level of clarity and certainty. So that's certainly a possibility. Socially, look, I think friends of mine who are medical specialists had me go to their place, not last weekend, but the weekend before, because one of them is an intensive care specialist and he's likely to be dealing with coronavirus people. And he wanted his will up to date and his power of attorney and enduring guardianship, just in case something happened. And we had it, obviously, because we were there, my wife and I were there for the purpose of signing up their wills in this particular situation. We discussed it. It's, from what he's currently saying, yes, it's exceedingly virulent. But unless you are statistically very old or you have a precondition, yes, you may get very, very sick, but you're not going to die. Statistically at the moment, less people are dying from this than they are from the normal flu that we get injections for each year.
Yep.
Over time, at the moment, we have no herd immunity to this particular strain of the coronavirus. As more and more people get it, then the herd immunity will grow. And as a consequence of that, we will have a degree of protection as a group. For example, I was listening to radio in Sydney this morning, and I don't know whether he goes down in Melbourne, but Alan Jones was talking, and he was talking to Ron Wilkinson, and Ron Wilkinson was dealing with Tom Hanks and his wife, and he's now been diagnosed as having the coronavirus and is being put away for 14 days, but he actually has been diagnosed as having the virus. And he was on the phone. He's saying, like, I've had it for a few days and I feel fine. He said, I feel a bit of a charlatan because I have been diagnosed as having this, but I've got no sniffles, no sore throat, no nothing. But I have it, and therefore I have the ability to pass it on. So we just have to wait and see. We need to be careful. We need to be precaution, but I don't think we should be all heading off to Switzerland and taking the euthanasia injection just at this point in time.
Yes, let's not rush to that. What is it about lemmings running off cliffs?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Like, I personally have not gone out and stocked up on toilet paper.
Nor I, as a matter of fact, and I'm still confused as to why. First, why we picked toilet paper, and second, why did the fear take over to the extent that everybody wanted to do it?
And I just think it's just one of those things that, because someone, it's like when you're in the street and someone's,
Yep.
and I think people saw other people taking toilet paper, so someone said they must know something, and then they went, what I don't understand is why there hasn't been a run on beer. No, surely if it's your last day, you want to be drinking to put yourself to sleep, not going to the toilet wiping your bottom. I don't get it.
So anyway, what we focus on, of course, grows. We focus on something and it grows. We focus on the fear, it grows. We focus on good things come to us. However, you mentioned that in future you will probably write into contracts something about a pandemic. Now, I'm imagining that somewhere around 1919, 1920, there was a lawyer sitting in his office who said, by golly gee, I think this pandemic thing might become an issue in the future. I'm going to write that into contracts. How on earth did we forget to do that over the course of a century?
I think it's to do with the fact, well, one, it would only arise in a force majeure clause.
Mm-hmm.
And force majeure clauses only came into existence in 1915.
Oh, well,
so,
there we are.
Yeah, so in the common law world, the whole concept of a force majeure clause was only first looked at in a 1915 case. There's no common law history prior to that date.
Yep.
So you've got someone only 4 years later putting it in there. And as I say, I don't think that it had the impact, the commercial impact, that the Spanish flu didn't have the same degree of commercial impact that the coronavirus may have. Consequently, those people around 1919 just may not have thought of it.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, with the force majeure being only 4 years old, at that time you might very well have thought that was sufficient.
Yes. And they may also have thought that there's generally a catch-all in many force majeure clauses where they talk about an act of God.
Mm.
And I would have thought in 1919, a pandemic may well have been treated by a court as an act of God, whereas I don't think that in 2020, a court would look at it in the same way.
Yeah. That sounds a perfectly reasonable explanation to me. So
I think Kerry had a question, which could you write here the name of the clause, please? I can't spell it. Okay. Where do I write that?
I can do it. Force, M-A-J-U-I-R-E?
No, M-A-J-E-U-R-E.
I was close.
You were. It's French.
It's so long since I've seen it, Stephen. I thought it had an I in it, but
No. I'm just, and you know, if someone wants some light reading, I know this is one book just on force majeure clauses.
Goodness me.
So it's
Yes, I think there was a time when I was about 15 that I thought maybe lawyering might be the way to go. I think the reading might have got me out of that. The need to read so much, perhaps.
yes.
I
I just wish I could read
the information, but not that much. So, have we got something a short suggestion we can make to people to maybe give them just a little bit of confidence that the world is not necessarily going to hell right now? That's too much of a legal jungle.
Yeah. Hold on a minute. Just give me 2 seconds.
Two questions in the chat. People want to answer, but 250 people.
In order to do that, I think I need to get my Harry Potter wand out.
Good point. And
So,
I do have a couple of other questions here too. I just didn't notice straight away.
Yeah. Look, I really don't think it's as bad as what it is. I think it's a bit like, it's more serious than the 2000. For those of us who were around in 2000, you can all remember what was going to happen. All the computers were going to crash. The planes were going to fall out of the sky. Ships were going to do circles because the computers couldn't handle going from 1999 to 2000. So we had the Y2K issue. And there were consultants galore going money and doing this. And it was a furphy. The year 2000 came, the nanosecond passed, no planes fell out of the sky, no ships were lost, no computers crashed, and we all just kept on going, and people spent a lot of money for nothing. This one, I think, has a lot more real ramifications. It has dire ramifications for those who contract coronavirus, because you can die and people will die. There is no doubt that there will be deaths as a consequence of this. But is it the end of the world? No. I think we have more to fear personally from climate change alarmists than what we have from the coronavirus.
That sounds fair. Let's get those stocks of toilet paper back on the supermarket shelves.
Exactly.
Now we've got a question from the live stream through Facebook. My entertainers are suffering with cancellations. I need to replace live workshops with online. People are cancelling. Which platform is best? Well, we don't want to ask you, Stephen, about which platform. That's not your area of expertise. But entertainers are suffering with cancellations.
There's two different questions there.
Yeah. So then we've got, I need to replace live workshops with online.
Send them to my webinar.
How might we address that? I think we actually covered it earlier, but replacing live workshops with online, it's really a conversation with those people, isn't it? To make sure that they're comfortable with that.
Well, I think the steps that I would take is, one, change your terms and conditions immediately.
Yep.
So that in future, this particular situation is covered. So there is something you can do proactively now. So you're not doing that. So anyone who's got any terms and conditions, look at amending them to get your force majeure clause up to date. Consider putting a hardship clause in, and or sorry, that's the first thing. The second thing is now dealing with the people on a variation. That would be the things I'd be looking at. In regarding the cancellations, entertainers are suffering from cancellations. The first step is to look at the contract and what rights of cancellation are there, if any, in the contract. Because if there are no rights, the entertainers are still entitled to be paid. Mm-hmm. But if there are cancellation rights and they're cancelling in accordance with those rights, then there's not much you can do about it. Okay. But without seeing the contract, I can't say any more on that.
No, indeed. So look to the contract that you have, recognise the changes that are happening now, make the changes for the future, but deal with the contract that you have at this time under the terms that exist. Mm. Yeah. And if we're all sensible about it, we should be able to work our way through this.
Now, I had a client just the other day who runs a catering business, and they've had $300,000 worth of catering contracts cancelled because of events being cancelled, and that was in the space of a day.
Makes it hard when they were all due to happen within a week or two, doesn't it?
Yep.
So, yes, when you've put out that much money to make an event, that's going to hurt. Because now we've got to find a way to deal with all of those, stock that we've got on hand. What do we do? All sorts of things to be looked at. Stephen, thank you very much for your time this morning, and on short notice, but we thought that through business and other areas, that would be a good opportunity for us to get this information out to a lot of small businesses. For the benefit of people who don't know you, www.etienne.com.au.
Yes.
Etienne is Etienne.
Correct.
Etienne Lawyers. If you can't find etiennelawyers.com.au, just look up Stephen Brown Lawyer and you'll probably find him. So if you do want some help and support, Stephen is a very good place to start. We've got 2 new late messages. Are these? Okay, 3 things we should look at now. Yes, I think we've probably covered that. And there's the link in the chat, etiennelawyers.com.au.
Yeah, I think I would, the 3 things, just to recap, would be review your contracts, to look at the force majeure, look at hardship, and then consider whether, if you've got employee issues, get some advice as to whether you might be able to use Section 524 to stand down your employees if it comes to that.
Indeed. And there's also a link in the chat area for all of those online, taking you to an online presentation by Linda, running workshops and events virtually, an information session on running workshops and events virtually. So for those who do need to make a change, pop in there and get some ideas on how you might go about it. And with your magic wand, we better wave goodbye. Thank you, Stephen, for your help. For the other thing to mention, of course, is that I've got 2 more of these information sessions this afternoon, one with an employment person, one with an accountant person, to bring us up to date with what the government has offered in relation to small business and how they can be funded, etc. And of course, looking after your staff with our HR person. Stephen, thank you very much again, and we look forward to having you back another time. In the meantime, stay fit and healthy.
I will.
Yes, we are approaching that time when we're at risk of this thing, but of course, at the moment, we're not.
No, I'm going to lunch with someone today, so I'm going to put myself out there. I've spoken to those friends of mine who are the doctors, and they said at this point in time, just keep your distance and still keep living your life.
Yeah, indeed. And I did notice an article somewhere this morning suggesting that the UK has taken the complete opposite track to us here in Oz. They're saying just go about your business because it's got so far now, we'd better get the herd immunisation working. One more just came in, Stephen, before we let you go. Vic has now been announced as a state of emergency. Just concerned, my daughter works in the hospitality industry. Restaurants, cafes included in the shutdown. You're probably not even aware of that having happened.
No, being involved in this video, I've not been looking elsewhere, so I don't know what that entails at this point in time. So I don't know. Maybe I'm not going to lunch.
And indeed, look, in the post on the live stream in Facebook, there's a whole bunch of links there which might be able to give you the answers to that information. There's links to government bodies about the changes that are being made. Another comment, I know a lady who works in a major hotel chain and 50 to 60% workers are laid off and shifts are more than cut in half. Okay, so yeah, with the restrictions to travel, no doubt that was going to happen, that hotels and the like would be losing lots of business without the travellers coming into the country. So huge changes happening.
And that would be because most of those people will be part-time or casual employees,
yep,
or contractors.
Yes.
And so with a contractor, you may have a contract that you only require, or you only have an obligation to take up the services when requested. So if it's structured along those lines, and that's of course how many of these people are put off. And that's where we now have issues with the gig economy, because people are not on full-time employment.
Yes.
And so that's why people have got 2 and 3 jobs and driving around with Ubers and things of this nature, which is a whole other conversation. But when we've got things like the coronavirus, like from an employer's point of view, it's useful, because it means you're not stuck with having to pay out money that you're not getting revenue to compensate you for.
Mm.
But ultimately, we live in a society, and that society is us, which means that the people who ultimately suffer are the individuals.
Yes, we all have to work together.
Mm.
Seems a foreign concept at times, but it's been around all the time. We've got to work together.
Yeah.
Stephen, thank you very much for being here and providing the information. I'm hopeful we've helped a lot of folks to that end. We have had a few messages of support, so good on you. I'll let you get back to earning a quid and supporting your clients.
We'll see you again.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.